The rain hammered against the windshield as Victoria Sterling stepped out of her black Bentley, her stiletto heels clicking against the wet pavement like a metronome counting down the moments of another empty evening. The city lights blurred through the storm, casting shadows that danced across her porcelain face, a face that had graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, a face that commanded respect in boardrooms from Manhattan to Silicon Valley. But tonight, beneath those sharp green eyes that had stared down corporate sharks and emerged victorious, lay something different. Something fragile. At 34, Victoria had built an empire from nothing. Sterling Enterprises, her tech conglomerate, was worth $3.7 billion. She owned penthouses in 5 cities, a private jet, and enough power to topple governments with a single phone call. Her Black American Express Centurion card, the legendary Black Card, carried no preset spending limit. It was her weapon of choice, her universal key, her answer to every problem life threw her way. Money, she had learned early, was the only language the world truly understood. Yet as she walked through the glass doors of another charity gala, another evening of forced smiles and calculated conversations, Victoria felt the familiar hollow ache in her chest. The same ache that had followed her since her father's betrayal 10 years ago, since her ex-fiancé had sold her secrets to her biggest competitor, since she had learned that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. The ballroom was filled with Manhattan's elite, all eager to orbit around her wealth like moths to a flame. They laughed at her jokes, agreed with her every word, and saw nothing but dollar signs when they looked into her eyes. She had built walls so high that even she had forgotten what lay behind them. Her assistant, Margaret, had been with her for 8 years but still called her Miss Sterling. Her personal trainer spoke only when spoken to. Her driver, her chef, her security team, all professionals, all paid handsomely to keep their distance. Victoria had convinced herself this was strength, this was power. She had everything money could buy and nothing that money couldn't touch. The irony wasn't lost on her as she stood in that glittering ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of people yet feeling utterly, completely alone. The gala ended at midnight, and Victoria found herself walking to her car in the steady downpour, her Hermes coat doing little to shield her from the Chicago wind. The champagne had left her with a pounding headache, and the endless stream of small talk had drained what little energy she had left. As she fumbled with her keys, her phone buzzed with yet another message from the board of directors, another crisis that demanded her immediate attention, another fire that only she could put out. She never saw the puddle of oil that had leaked from a delivery truck hours earlier. Her heel caught the slick surface, and time seemed to slow as Victoria felt her body twist and fall. The world tilted sideways, her head struck the concrete with a sickening thud, and darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. Through the haze of pain and confusion, she could hear footsteps running toward her, a voice calling out through the rain. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" Victoria's eyes fluttered open to see a face hovering above her. Not the concerned expression of her driver, not the practiced efficiency of her security detail, but the genuine worry of a complete stranger. He was perhaps 38 or 39, with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. His dark hair was damp from the rain, his denim jacket soaked through, but he didn't seem to care about his own discomfort as he knelt beside her on the cold pavement. "Don't try to move," he said gently, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that seemed oddly comforting in the chaos of the city. "You hit your head pretty hard. I'm calling an ambulance." Victoria tried to sit up, her pride stinging more than her physical injuries. She wasn't accustomed to being vulnerable, to needing help, to being seen as anything less than invincible. "I'm fine," she insisted, though the world swayed dangerously when she moved. The stranger's hands were steady as he helped support her, careful not to be presumptuous, respectful of her space even as he offered assistance. "I'm sure you are, but let's just make sure, okay? My name's Daniel, by the way. Daniel Cooper." Something in his tone, patient, unhurried, devoid of the desperate eagerness she was accustomed to, made Victoria pause. She studied his face in the dim streetlight, searching for the calculation she expected to find, the moment when recognition would dawn and the performance would begin. But Daniel Cooper looked at her not as Victoria Sterling, the billionaire CEO, but simply as a woman who had fallen and needed help. When the paramedics arrived, Victoria felt compelled to reach into her purse. Her fingers found the familiar weight of her black card, that piece of titanium that had solved every problem, opened every door, bought every loyalty she'd ever needed. She held it out to Daniel with the practiced gesture of someone accustomed to purchasing gratitude. "For your trouble," she said, her voice still shaky from the fall but carrying its usual tone of authority. Daniel glanced at the card for just a moment before his eyes returned to hers. He didn't reach for it, didn't show the slightest interest in what it represented. Instead, he smiled. a genuine expression that reached his eyes and seemed to light up the rain-soaked street. "I don't need your money," he said quietly, his words cutting through the noise of the sirens and the traffic. "I just need you to stand up." And in that moment, for the first time in years, Victoria Sterling felt something crack in the fortress she had built around her heart. Daniel Cooper worked as a mechanic at Murphy's Auto Repair on the south side of Chicago, a job that paid the bills and little more. He lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment with his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, in a neighborhood where children still played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. He drove a 15-year-old Ford pickup truck that he had rebuilt himself, wore flannel shirts that had seen better years, and had never owned anything that could remotely be called expensive. But wealth, Daniel had learned, came in forms that couldn't be counted in bank statements. He had been 26 when his wife Sarah died in a car accident, leaving him to raise Emma alone. The grief had nearly destroyed him, but his daughter's laughter had slowly pieced his world back together. He worked long hours at the garage, came home to help Emma with her homework, cooked dinner on a hot plate when the stove was broken, and read her bedtime stories until she fell asleep. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a good life, filled with simple moments that felt like miracles. When Daniel saw Victoria fall that night, his first instinct hadn't been to recognize her from magazine covers or calculate what helping her might be worth. He saw a person in pain, and that was enough. He had learned to notice pain. It was impossible not to, when you had carried so much of your own. And there had been something in her eyes, beneath the shock and the pride, that reminded him of his own reflection in the months after Sarah's death. Something lost and searching, and desperately trying not to break. Victoria Sterling, he soon discovered, was not accustomed to being seen that way. 3 days after the accident, she appeared at Murphy's Auto Repair, looking absurdly out of place in her tailored Armani suit among the oil stains and spare parts. The other mechanics stopped what they were doing to stare, but Daniel simply looked up from the engine he was working on and nodded, as if billionaire CEOs dropped by the garage every Tuesday afternoon. "How's your head?" he asked, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Fine," Victoria replied, though she still wore a small bandage at her temple. She seemed uncertain, as if she hadn't quite planned what to say once she got there. "I wanted to thank you properly." She held out an envelope, thick with what was undoubtedly a substantial check. Daniel glanced at it, then back at her face. "Already told you I don't need your money," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But I appreciate the thought." Victoria's jaw tightened, the way it did in board meetings when someone dared to disagree with her. "Everyone needs money, Mr. Cooper. Everyone has a price." Daniel set down his tools and really looked at her then, studying her face with the same attention he might give to a difficult engine problem. "What makes you think that?" The question caught Victoria off guard. In her world, it was simply an accepted truth, as fundamental as gravity or the rising of the Sunday. People wanted money, power, influence, status. They wanted what she could give them, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. "Experience," she said finally. "That's a hell of a way to live," Daniel replied, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't judgment either. It was understanding, the kind that comes from recognizing pain in someone else because you've carried it yourself. Victoria felt her carefully constructed composure begin to slip. She wasn't used to conversations that went beneath the surface, wasn't prepared for the way Daniel's honesty seemed to strip away her usual defenses. In boardrooms, she controlled every variable, anticipated every argument, held all the cards. But here, surrounded by the honest smell of motor oil and hard work, she felt strangely powerless. "You don't know me," she said, and she intended it to sound dismissive, but it came out more like a question. "No," Daniel agreed, "but I know what it looks like when someone's been hurt. And I know what it looks like when someone's forgotten how to let people help them." The words hung in the air between them, and Victoria realized that Daniel Cooper was the first person in years to speak to her without an agenda, without calculation, without the desperate hunger that money seemed to inspire in everyone else. It was terrifying and liberating and completely foreign to everything she thought she knew about human nature. Over the following weeks, something strange began to happen to Victoria Sterling's carefully ordered world. She found herself driving past Murphy's Auto Repair at odd hours, sometimes stopping in under the pretense of checking on her car or asking about preventive maintenance. The conversations were brief and seemingly inconsequential. Discussions about engine timing and oil changes, and whether the upcoming winter would be harsh. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. Daniel treated her with the same easy courtesy he showed everyone else, but he also challenged her in ways no one had dared to in years. When she mentioned working 16-hour days, he asked if that was really living, or just existing. When she complained about people only wanting her money, He wondered aloud if she might be seeing what she expected to see rather than what was actually there. His questions weren't confrontational, but they were persistent, like water slowly wearing away stone. You ever just sit somewhere and watch the world go by? Daniel asked one afternoon as Victoria waited for her car's oil change. I don't have time for that, Victoria replied automatically. That's not what I asked, Daniel said, looking up from under the hood. I asked if you ever do it. Victoria paused, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had simply existed without purpose, without agenda, without the constant pressure to perform or produce or profit. The thought was almost absurd. Billionaire CEOs didn't have time for idleness. Why would I? She asked. Daniel straightened up, considering his answer. Because that's when you notice things. Like how Mrs. Rodriguez next door always leaves extra food on her windowsill for the stray cats, even though she's barely making rent. Or how the old man at the corner store remembers every kid's name and asks about their report cards. Small things, but they add up to something bigger. And what's that? Proof that most people are good, even when no one's paying them to be. The idea was so foreign to Victoria's experience that she almost laughed. But something in Daniel's expression stopped her. Not the evangelical fervor of someone trying to convert her to their worldview, but the quiet confidence of someone who had seen evidence of what he believed. Victoria found herself thinking about that conversation long after she left the garage, and she began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way her elderly neighbor, Mr. Kowalski, always held the elevator for other residents, even when he was clearly in a hurry. The way the barista at her favorite coffee shop remembered her order, and always asked about her day, not because she tipped well but because she seemed to genuinely care. Small kindnesses that existed without transaction, without expectation of return. It was a revelation that shook the foundation of everything Victoria thought she knew about human nature. The shift in perspective began to show in unexpected ways. Victoria started arriving at work a few minutes later, taking time to actually look at the city as she was driven through it rather than scrolling through emails. She began to notice the faces of her employees, really notice them, and was surprised to discover that many of them weren't the money-hungry schemers she had assumed them to be, but dedicated professionals who took pride in their work and cared about the company's mission. When her assistant Margaret mentioned that her son was struggling in school, Victoria found herself offering not money or connections but time, an hour of tutoring from her own extensive knowledge of mathematics and science. Margaret's surprise and gratitude were so genuine that Victoria wondered how she had missed the fact that what people often needed most wasn't what she could buy them, but what she could give of herself. But it was Daniel's daughter who truly began to crack open the walls around Victoria's heart. Emma Cooper was 7 years old, with her father's warm brown eyes and her late mother's delicate features. She had the kind of unguarded curiosity that only children possess, and she seemed utterly unimpressed by Victoria's status or wealth. When Victoria finally met her at the garage, one Saturday afternoon, Emma's first question wasn't about her fancy car or expensive clothes, but about the small scar on Victoria's temple from the fall. Does it hurt? Emma asked with the direct concern that only children can manage. Not anymore, Victoria replied, touched by the genuine worry in the little girl's voice. Daddy says scars are like medals for being brave, Emma said matter-of-factly. You must have been really brave. Victoria looked at Daniel, who was watching the interaction with a soft smile, and felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. No one had called her brave for surviving pain before. They had called her strong, ruthless, successful, but never brave. Would you like to see where I work? Victoria found herself asking, surprising even herself with the spontaneous invitation. Emma's eyes lit up with excitement, and before Victoria quite knew how it had happened, she was giving a 7-year-old a tour of the Sterling Enterprises headquarters on a Saturday morning. Watching Emma's wonder at the view from the 42nd floor, and her delight at being allowed to sit in the CEO's chair and pretend to run important meetings. But it was when they stopped by Victoria's private kitchen, a amenity she had insisted on but rarely used, that the real magic happened. Emma noticed the pristine condition of everything and asked innocently if Victoria knew how to cook. Of course I can cook, Victoria said, though the truth was she couldn't remember the last time she had prepared anything more complex than coffee. Can you make pancakes? Emma asked hopefully. And so Victoria Sterling, who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers and commanded the respect of world leaders, found herself struggling to make pancakes from a boxed mix while a 7-year-old offered patient encouragement and gentle corrections. The first batch burned. The second batch was lopsided. The third batch was barely edible. But Emma ate them with enthusiasm, declared them the best grown-up pancakes ever, and asked if Victoria could teach her how to make them too. As they sat at the massive conference table, eating imperfect pancakes and drinking orange juice from crystal glasses, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years: pure, uncomplicated joy. There was no agenda here, no calculation, no transaction. Just a little girl who was happy to share breakfast with someone she liked. And a woman who was remembering what it felt like to be liked for something other than what she could provide. When Daniel came to pick up Emma that afternoon, he found them building a fort out of office chairs and expensive throw pillows, both of them laughing at some joke Victoria was telling. The sight of his daughter so comfortable with Victoria, and Victoria so natural with Emma, did something to Daniel's carefully guarded heart. "Thank you," he said quietly as Emma gathered her things. "She hasn't been this happy since." He didn't finish the sentence, but Victoria understood. Since her mother died. Since the world became a place where 7-year-olds had to learn about loss and grief and the fragility of the people they loved. "She's wonderful," Victoria said, and meant it. "You're raising an incredible little girl." "We're raising each other," Daniel replied, and Victoria caught something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. There was admiration there, and warmth, and something else that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with business or power or control. But Victoria Sterling had learned long ago that good things didn't last, and that the higher you climbed, the further you had to fall. The first warning shot came in the form of a phone call from Richard Blackwood, the chairman of Sterling Enterprises' board of directors. He had heard rumors, he said, about Victoria's new association with certain individuals of questionable status. There were photographs, apparently, Victoria entering Murphy's Auto Repair, Victoria with Emma at the company headquarters, Victoria looking more relaxed and happy than she had in years. "Your personal life is your own business," Richard said in the smooth voice that had helped him navigate 3 decades of corporate politics, "but when it affects the company's image, it becomes our business too." Victoria had expected this conversation eventually. She had built Sterling Enterprises to be bulletproof against this kind of gossip, but she had also learned that in the world of high-stakes business, perception was often more important than reality. "My personal life has never affected my professional performance," Victoria replied coolly, falling back into the armor of corporate speak that had protected her for so long. "Of course not," Richard agreed, "but investors are asking questions. There's talk of a romance with a blue-collar mechanic, speculation about your judgment, concerns about your priorities. We need to control the narrative before it controls us." Victoria felt the familiar clench of anger in her chest, not at Richard, who was simply doing his job, but at a system that measured a person's worth by their bank account and their bloodline. The same system that had made her rich and powerful and utterly, desperately alone. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Distance yourself," Richard said simply. Quietly, cleanly, completely. "Focus on the merger with Hartley Tech. Show the board and the investors that Sterling Enterprises is still your top priority." After hanging up the phone, Victoria sat in her office for a long time, staring out at the city that had once seemed like her kingdom. The Chicago skyline stretched before her, full of lights and possibilities and the dreams of 8 million people trying to make their way in the world. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably helping Emma with her homework, or reading her a bedtime story, or simply being the kind of father Victoria had never known she wanted to find. But the walls she had built around her heart weren't just for protection, they were for isolation. And isolation, she had learned, was the price of power. When Victoria stopped coming to the garage, Daniel noticed immediately but said nothing. He understood enough about her world to know that their friendship, and the deeper feelings that had been growing beneath it, posed a threat to everything she had built. He had seen the photographers lurking outside Murphy's Auto Repair, had heard the whispers and speculation, had watched Victoria's expression grow more guarded with each passing day. He missed her, more than he cared to admit. Missed her unexpected questions, her gradual smile, the way she listened to Emma's stories with complete attention. Missed the glimpse he had gotten of the woman beneath the CEO, the person Victoria might have been if the world had been gentler to her. Emma asked about Victoria daily for the first week, then less frequently, but Daniel could see the disappointment in his daughter's eyes every time she looked toward the garage's front door with hope. "Is Victoria coming back?" Emma asked one evening as Daniel tucked her into bed. "I don't know, sweetheart," Daniel replied honestly. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices. Did we do something wrong?" The question broke Daniel's heart, because he could hear his own doubts reflected in his daughter's voice. Had he pushed too hard? Had he misread Victoria's feelings? Had he been foolish to think that someone from her world could find happiness in his? "No, baby," he said, smoothing Emma's hair. "You did everything right. Sometimes people just get scared." But even as he said it, Daniel wondered if scared was the right word. Maybe realistic was better. Maybe practical. Maybe Victoria had simply remembered that fairy tales didn't exist in the real world, and that billionaire CEOs didn't fall in love with single-father mechanics who lived paycheck to paycheck. The crisis that forced Victoria's hand came 3 weeks later, when Emma developed a high fever that spiked to 105 degrees in the middle of the night. Daniel rushed her to the emergency room, where doctors ran tests, and spoke in hushed tones, and used words like serious and concerned and overnight observation. The bills began arriving before Emma was even released from the hospital. Daniel's insurance covered most of the costs, but not all, and the remainder was more than he made in 3 months at the garage. He applied for assistance programs, negotiated payment plans, picked up extra shifts whenever possible, but the numbers were unforgiving. He could have called Victoria. She would have helped, he knew that with absolute certainty. One phone call, and Emma's medical bills would disappear without even making a dent in Victoria's vast fortune. But Daniel also knew that accepting that help would change something fundamental between them, would turn their relationship into the kind of transaction he had been so careful to avoid. Instead, he sold his guitar, the one Sarah had given him for their first anniversary. He sold his grandmother's ring, the one he had been saving for Emma's wedding day. He sold everything of value he owned and picked up a second job delivering pizzas on weekends, working 18-hour days until exhaustion became his constant companion. Victoria learned about Emma's illness not from Daniel, but from a private investigator she had hired to keep a discreet eye on their safety. The report landed on her desk like a physical blow, filled with medical records and bills, and the stark reality of what it meant to navigate a crisis without unlimited resources. She stared at the numbers on the page, amounts that represented nothing to her but everything to Daniel. The cost of Emma's care was less than Victoria spent on shoes in a typical month, but she knew that offering to pay would be seen as charity, as the very transaction Daniel had been so careful to avoid. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling's money felt like a burden rather than a tool. She sat in her office until 3 in the morning, staring at those medical bills and thinking about Emma's bright smile and Daniel's quiet strength, and the way they had both made her feel like a better version of herself. She thought about the fort they had built in her conference room, and the imperfect pancakes they had shared, and the moment when Emma had called her scars medals for being brave. And she realized that the bravest thing she could do was not to respect Daniel's pride, but to find a way to help without making it feel like charity. Victoria had built her fortune on finding creative solutions to impossible problems. And this was just another puzzle that needed solving. The next morning, Murphy's Auto Repair received a call from Sterling Enterprises' Fleet Management Division. The company was looking for a new primary vendor for their vehicle maintenance needs. 300 cars and trucks that would require regular service, repairs, and upgrades. The contract was worth more than the garage typically made in 3 years. And it came with an advance payment for equipment upgrades and staff expansion. Daniel knew it was Victoria's doing, of course. Corporate fleets didn't typically choose small neighborhood garages for their service needs. But the contract was legitimate, the work was real, and the payment was for services rendered rather than charity received. He also knew that Emma would be able to see the best doctors in the city, that her college fund would be secure, that the fear that kept him awake at night, the fear that he wouldn't be able to provide for his daughter, had been quietly and elegantly eliminated. But it was the handwritten note tucked into the contract that brought tears to his eyes. Some scars are invisible, but they still deserve medals for bravery. Thank you for showing me what courage really looks like. V. The board meeting that would determine Victoria's future at Sterling Enterprises was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October, exactly 6 months after she had met Daniel Cooper on a rain-soaked street. The conference room on the 42nd floor was filled with the most powerful people in corporate America, men and women who controlled assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and who had gathered to decide whether Victoria Sterling was still fit to lead the company she had built from nothing. Richard Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, as he outlined the concerns that had been raised about Victoria's recent behavior. The photographs, the gossip, the questions about her judgment and priorities. The merger with Hartley Tech hung in the balance, worth $12 billion, and dependent on investor confidence in Sterling Enterprises' leadership. We're not questioning your competence, Victoria, Richard said in his smooth boardroom voice. Your track record speaks for itself. But leadership isn't just about performance, it's about perception. And right now, the perception is that you're distracted. That your attention is divided, that Sterling Enterprises may not be your top priority anymore. Victoria sat at the opposite end of the table, looking every inch the polished executive in her charcoal gray suit and perfectly styled hair. But beneath the professional exterior, something fundamental had changed. The woman who had once seen every interaction through the lens of profit and loss now understood that some things couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. You're right, Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. My priorities have changed. A murmur rippled through the room, board members exchanging glances and preparing for the inevitable damage control that would follow Victoria's resignation. But Victoria wasn't done. For 15 years, I've built this company on the belief that success was measured solely by profit margins and market share. I've treated employees like assets, competitors like enemies, and relationships like transactions. And I've been extraordinarily successful by those standards. Victoria stood, walking to the wall of windows that offered a commanding view of the city below. But I've also been extraordinarily unhappy. And more importantly, I've been wrong about what makes a company truly great. She turned back to face the room, her green eyes bright with conviction. The most valuable asset Sterling Enterprises has aren't our patents or our market position or our cash reserves. They're the people who choose to work here, who believe in what we're building, who stay not because we pay them the most but because they feel valued and respected and part of something meaningful. Victoria, Richard began, but she held up a hand. I'm not resigning, Victoria said clearly. But I am proposing a fundamental shift in how we do business. Starting with the way we treat our own employees and extending to how we engage with our communities. Corporate social responsibility isn't just a PR strategy, it's a business imperative. Companies that prioritize only profit are companies that eventually collapse under their own isolation. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. I've spent the last month developing a comprehensive plan for transforming Sterling Enterprises into a benefit corporation, a company that considers the impact of its decisions on all stakeholders, not just shareholders. The financial projections are all there, but the bottom line is this. Companies that prioritize people and purpose alongside profit consistently outperform their competitors in the long term. The room was silent as board members absorbed this unexpected turn. They had come prepared for drama, for accusations, for the kind of corporate theater that made headlines. They hadn't expected a business proposal that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their industry. And the personal situation? Asked Helena Morrison, the board's longest-serving member. Victoria smiled for the first time since entering the room. The personal situation is that I've learned the difference between being respected and being feared, between being powerful and being influential, between being successful and being fulfilled. I've found people who see value in kindness and strength in vulnerability, and courage in choosing love over fear. She paused, looking around the table at faces she had known for years but had never really seen. I'm in love with a man who fixes cars for a living, and raises his daughter with more wisdom and integrity than I've encountered in any boardroom. And if that makes me unfit to lead Sterling Enterprises, then perhaps Sterling Enterprises needs to reconsider what kind of leadership it really wants. The vote was closer than Victoria had expected, 7 in favor of her remaining as CEO, 5 opposed. But it was enough, and more importantly, it was the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond the walls of the 42nd floor. When Victoria called Daniel that evening to tell him about the board meeting, she could hear Emma's laughter in the background and the sound of dinner being prepared in their small kitchen. How did it go? Daniel asked. I chose us, Victoria said simply. I chose love over fear, and truth over perception, and I chose to build something real instead of just profitable. And the board was okay with that? Victoria laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. They voted to keep me as CEO, but more importantly, they voted to become the kind of company that would be worthy of the people we love. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Victoria could picture Daniel's smile, warm and genuine and free of calculation. Does this mean you're free for pancakes this weekend? He asked. Emma's been practicing her flipping technique, and I think she's ready to show you her skills. I'll be there, Victoria promised. And Daniel? Thank you for teaching me what it means to stand up. Spring came early to Chicago that year, filling the city with the kind of hope that makes people believe in new beginnings. Victoria Sterling married Daniel Cooper in Murphy's auto repair garage on a Saturday afternoon in May, surrounded by mechanics and board members and neighborhood kids and corporate executives who had never imagined they would find themselves in the same room, much less celebrating the same joy. Emma served as maid of honor, wearing a dress she had picked out herself, and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that Victoria had thought more beautiful than any arrangement money could buy. The ceremony was officiated by Father Miguel from Daniel's parish, a man who spoke about love being not a feeling but a choice, not a transaction but a gift, not a weakness but the greatest strength any person could possess. Victoria's wedding dress was simple, elegant, and purchased off the rack from a department store downtown. A choice that made headlines in the business press but felt perfectly right to the woman who was learning that the most valuable things in life were often the least expensive. They honeymooned not in Paris or Tuscany, but at a cabin in Wisconsin, where Victoria learned to fish and Daniel learned to appreciate wine that cost more than $20 a bottle, And Emma learned that sometimes families are built not by blood but by choice, not by accident but by intention, not by need but by love. Sterling Enterprises, under Victoria's continued leadership, became the first major corporation in their sector to achieve B-Corp certification, measuring success not just in profits, but in positive impact on employees, communities, and the environment. The company's stock price initially dropped, as investors questioned the new direction, but within 2 years it had reached all-time highs as consumers and top talent flocked to a company that stood for something more than quarterly earnings. Victoria kept her black card, but it gathered dust in a drawer as she discovered that the most meaningful purchases couldn't be bought. They could only be chosen, nurtured, and shared. She learned to cook, with varying degrees of success, and consistent degrees of laughter from her new family. She learned to help Emma with homework, to attend school plays and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences with the same attention she had once reserved for board meetings. She learned that the sound of Daniel's key in the door at the end of a long day was better than any merger announcement or acquisition approval. But most importantly, Victoria Sterling learned that the cure she had been seeking all those years, the healing for the wounds that money couldn't touch, hadn't come from a treatment or a transaction or a therapist's couch. It had come from a man who saw her not as a CEO or a billionaire or a prize to be won, but as a woman who had forgotten how to let herself be loved. It had come from a little girl who called her scars medals for bravery and meant it. It had come from the radical act of choosing vulnerability over control, connection over isolation, and love over fear. And on quiet Sunday mornings, when Victoria would wake up between Daniel and Emma in their modest Chicago home, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a real family. Emma's art projects covering the refrigerator, Daniel's guitar leaning against the wall, their 3 coffee mugs in the sink from the night before. She would remember that rainy night when she had fallen on a dark street, and a stranger had helped her stand. She had offered him her black card, thinking that money was the only currency that mattered. But Daniel Cooper had taught her a different kind of economics. One where kindness was the capital, where time was the investment, and where love was the only return that truly counted. Victoria Sterling had spent her entire adult life building an empire, but she had discovered that the kingdom she had been searching for all along was small enough to fit around a kitchen table, rich enough to be measured in bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes, and powerful enough to heal wounds that she had thought would never stop bleeding. The cure she needed hadn't come from a card with no spending limit, but from a man with no agenda except loving her, and a little girl who had taught her that the bravest thing anyone can do is simply choose to stand up, one more time, and try again.